The wind had a way of talking out here, low and mean, as if it carried every ghost the prairie had ever made. That night it scraped across the Carter place, rattling the barn doors and sending the horses shifting in their stalls. Elias Carter pulled his coat tighter, breath hanging in the cold. He'd been fixing a broken hinge on the feed room when he heard it, a sound too soft to belong to any of his stock. He froze, lantern held high. The rain tapped on the roof in a steady rhythm. But beneath it came something else. A muffled cough, a sharp intake of breath, a small whimper quickly smothered. His jaw tightened. "Who's there?" No answer. Just the restless shifting of a horse, then stillness. He stepped past the tack wall, boots crunching over scattered straw, eyes straining into the far shadows. The lantern's glow fell over a shape. No, several shapes, huddled in the corner, covered in a filthy horse blanket. The cough came again. A child's cough. He lowered the lantern and saw them clearly, a gaunt woman, her hair plastered to her face, eyes wide and wary. 3 little ones pressed against her. The oldest, maybe 7, clutching the 2 smaller ones close, their bare toes blue from the cold. The youngest, a curly-haired boy, looked too tired to even lift his head. Elias's voice came out flat. "What the hell are you doing in my barn?" The woman's voice was rough from cold and fear. We didn't mean to trespass. We just needed to get out of the wind." "That's my hay you're lying on." He shifted the lantern higher, seeing their threadbare clothes. The mud caked up their shins. "You walked in this weather?" She nodded once, lips trembling. 2 days since we last stopped. The little one, he can't keep walking." The boy's breathing was shallow. Elias set the lantern on a barrel and squatted to their level, eyes flicking over their thin arms and hollow cheeks. It stirred something old in him, an image he'd buried of his late wife bending over her sister's bed, begging him to fetch a doctor. He hadn't made it in time. "You can't stay here," he said, more to himself than to them. "A storm's rolling in. You'll freeze before morning." "We can work," she said quickly, her hand tightening on the oldest child's shoulder. "I can cook, clean, whatever you need. Just don't send us back out." Her voice carried a desperation that clawed at him. But strangers in the frontier were trouble. Supplies were thin already, and winter had a way of stripping a man down to the bone. Elias stood, pulling the blanket tighter around the smallest child. "Where you headed?" "North. Fort Ellison." She hesitated, then glanced toward the barn door as if someone might be listening. "But they're looking for us. We just need to get past." She broke off, the sentence swallowed by a distant crack. "Gunfire." It came faint, but sharp, carried on the wind. Elias's hand went to the rifle propped by the stall wall. The woman's face drained of color. "They found us," she whispered. He doused the lantern in a single motion, plunging them into darkness broken only by the thin lines of moonlight between the barn boards. Outside, hoofbeats approached, slow and deliberate. Elias motioned for silence, easing toward the door. He could make out 3 riders through the slats, shapes shifting in the mist. They paused near the barn, voices low. One laughed, a sound without warmth, then spat in the dirt. After a moment, they rode on toward the ridge, the sound of their horses fading into the wind. When Elias turned back, the woman had pulled her children closer, eyes glistening in the dark. "If you send us out, they'll kill us," she said softly. He believed her. He thought of the trip to town, the meager sacks of flour and beans left in the pantry, the long months ahead before spring. He thought of the nights he'd sat at his table alone, listening to the wind whistle through the chinks in the cabin wall, feeling nothing but the hollow quiet where his wife's voice used to be. Some choices a man makes because he thinks them through. Others come like a spark to dry tinder. "Come on," he said. "Get them inside." The relief on her face was so sudden it almost looked like pain. She gathered the children quickly, the oldest supporting the smallest, and followed him out into the rain. The wind knifed at them, but his cabin stood only a dozen yards from the barn, its chimney already puffing a thin trail of smoke. Inside, the heat from the hearth wrapped around them. Elias set a kettle over the fire and fetched an old quilt from the bed. The children clustered near the flames, their eyes fixed on the flicker of light as though it was the first they'd seen in days. He ladled broth into a tin cup and handed it to the woman. She gave it to the youngest, guiding the cup to his lips. When the boy swallowed, her shoulders sagged with relief. "What's your name?" Elias asked. "Clara Dawson." She hesitated, her gaze steady despite the exhaustion in it. "These are my children, Anna, Luke, and Matthew." Elias nodded once, filing the names away. "I'm Elias Carter." For a moment, the only sound was the fire popping and the storm clawing at the roof. Clara's eyes roamed the cabin. Sparse furnishings, a single table and chair, shelves of tools and canned goods. She was assessing. He realized the same way he was. "You planning to keep running?" he asked. "If we can make it north, there's a place I can work. A friend who might take us in." She looked down at her hands, raw and chapped. "But we can't go now. Not with them so close." He studied her, weighing the truth in her words. Something in her tone told him she wasn't giving him the whole of it. But that was a problem, for another day. Tonight the problem was the men on the ridge. "You'll sleep here tonight," he said. "Tomorrow we'll figure the rest." Clara nodded, murmuring thanks, though her eyes stayed on the window. Elias followed her gaze, seeing nothing but darkness and the faint sheen of rain on the glass. Still, he knew the kind of men who hunted women and children. They wouldn't give up easy. He stoked the fire, the flames throwing shadows along the log walls. The children had curled up under the quilt, already drifting into uneasy sleep. Clara sat stiff-backed by the hearth, as if afraid to close her eyes. Elias leaned his rifle against the wall within easy reach. "If you hear anything in the night, wake me." She glanced at him, a flicker of gratitude softening her expression. "I will." The wind outside rose to a howl, but inside the cabin the air was warm and close. Elias sat in the single chair, watching the flames lick at the logs, listening for hoofbeats that didn't come. He'd told himself it was only for the night, just until the storm passed. But deep down, a part of him already knew better. Some choices change the course of a man's life before he even knows he's made them. By the time the first pale light slid over the horizon, the storm had blown itself ragged, leaving the world quiet and heavy with frost. Elias stepped out onto the porch, breath clouding in the sharp morning air, and saw the barn roof glistening with a thin skin of ice. Behind him, the soft sound of a ladle against tin told him Clara was already awake. Inside, she was moving carefully so as not to wake the children, ladling the last of the broth into 3 small cups. Her hair was tied back now, and there was a certain tightness to her shoulders, less from cold than from the knowledge they were still being hunted. The little ones stirred slowly, rubbing sleep from their eyes, their small hands clutching the warmth in the cups as though it might vanish. Elias sat at the table, the wood worn smooth by years of use, and watched her without comment. The woman had a way of working, quick and deliberate, no wasted motion. It spoke of years spent keeping a household together under conditions most men would call unbearable. After the children had eaten, he led them outside to help split kindling. Anna, the oldest, followed him without being asked, watching his every move. She didn't speak much, but her eyes were sharp, and she handled the smaller hatchet as if it wasn't her first time. Clara watched from a porch, one arm wrapped around the youngest, the middle boy crouched at her side. The hours passed in the quiet rhythm of chores, mending a stall door, hauling water, checking the traps along the creek. Clara offered to help without hesitation, taking to the work as though she'd been on the place for years. Elias found himself watching her in those small moments, the way she knelt to scrape mud from a chicken's foot, the way she steadied her voice when the youngest started crying, even though her eyes betrayed how tired she was. It was near sundown with the shadows stretching long across the yard when they sat down by the hearth, and she finally told him her story in full. Her voice was low, careful, as though speaking the words too loudly might summon trouble to the door. Her husband, Thomas Dawson, had once ridden with a gang that roamed the territories between Kansas and the Dakota line. He'd been good at it, too good, she said, and the life had sunk its hooks in deep. But after Matthew was born, Thomas had tried to leave. The gang's leader, a man named Clay Harlan, saw it as betrayal. One night, while Clara was putting the children to bed, the gang came. Thomas didn't survive. She'd taken the children and fled, heading north toward Fort Ellison, where she had a childhood friend who might give them shelter. Elias listened without interrupting, though his jaw clenched at the mention of Harlan's name. He knew the type, men who treated fear as currency, trading it for whatever they wanted. When she finished, she didn't meet his eyes, as if expecting him to turn her out for bringing that kind of danger to his door. Instead, he poured her a cup of coffee and pushed it across the table. "You were right to run," he said, "and you were right to stop here." The days that followed were filled with a wary sort of peace. The children adjusted quickly to life on the ranch. Anna shadowed Elias during the day, eager to learn how to mend fences and check stock. Luke preferred staying near the barn, watching the horses with quiet fascination. Matthew was happiest near the fire with his mother. Clara took on the cooking without being asked, and the cabin began to smell of bread again, something Elias hadn't realized he'd missed until the scent wrapped around him like an old memory. But food was running low. The storm had delayed him from riding into town, and now the shelves in the pantry were thinning fast. Elias knew what that meant. He'd have to make the trip, and soon. He told Clara over breakfast, the two of them speaking quietly so as not to wake the children. She didn't argue, but her fingers twisted in her lap. "If they're watching the roads, they won't expect me to be carrying anyone but myself," he said. "I'll keep to the timber where I can." The next morning, before the first real light, he saddled the bay mare and set out. The air bit at his face, the snow underfoot, making each hoofbeat sound sharper in the stillness. He kept off the main trail, following a deer track through the pines until the trees thinned near the trading post. Inside, the place was warm with the scent of coffee and tobacco. Elias kept his hat low, choosing sacks of flour, beans, salt, and dried apples, moving through the shelves with deliberate speed. It wasn't until he reached the counter that he noticed the man in the corner, lean frame, dark coat, eyes following him without pretense. The storekeep rang up his purchases, and as Elias hefted the sacks, the man spoke. "You seen a woman traveling with 3 young uns? Might have passed through here in the last week." Elias didn't pause. "Haven't seen a soul, but the neighbor's cattle," he said, voice flat. The man studied him for a beat too long, then offered a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. "If you do, you let her know Clay Harlan's looking to have a word." Elias met his gaze for just long enough to make his meaning clear. "If I see her, I'll pass it along." He walked out without looking back, loading the supplies quickly. The snow was falling again, light and steady, by the time he left town. But he wasn't alone on the trail. The hoofbeats came first, steady, closing the distance. Elias nudged the mare off the path, guiding her into a shallow ravine where the snow muffled their movements. Through the pines, he caught glimpses of a rider shadowing the trail, staying just far enough behind. Elias cut through a frozen creek bed, pushing the mare hard until the sound faded, then doubled back through the timber. It added an hour to his ride, but when he reached the ridge overlooking his ranch, the only tracks behind him were his own. The sight of the cabin's thin chimney smoke brought a small measure of relief, but that feeling evaporated when he saw the prints in the snow near the house, fresh, too big to be any of the children's. Clara was at the door before he dismounted. "Someone came while you were gone," she said. "I heard a horse. Didn't open the door." Elias's eyes swept the yard, noting the trail of prints leading toward the road. "They're circling, testing for a weak spot." That night, he kept the rifle by the table and a lamp burning low. Clara sat across from him, the children already asleep in the loft. "You risked yourself for us today," she said quietly. "I didn't much feel like it was a choice," he replied. "You could have said no when we knocked on your barn." He leaned back, the chair creaking. "Could have, but I didn't." They sat in the warm silence for a moment, the fire casting gold across the floor. For the first time in years, Elias felt the quiet wasn't empty. It was full of danger, of responsibility, and of something else he didn't dare name just yet. When he finally went to bed, the wind had risen again, scraping along the roof. Somewhere out there, men were watching, but for tonight, the walls held. And for tonight, that was enough. The dawn broke cold and still, the kind of winter morning where even the birds kept silent. Frost rimmed the windows, and the air inside the cabin felt sharper than it had the day before. Elias Carter stood on the porch with his coat collar turned up, watching the yard as if it might tell him what the day had planned. The prints in the snow from the night before had been half filled by drifting powder, but their direction was clear enough. They'd come from the south ridge, the one road in and out of this stretch of land. Clara came to stand beside him, her shawl drawn tight. She didn't ask if they were still out there. She didn't have to. Her eyes held the same knowledge his did. Men like Harlan's crew didn't wander off without taking what they came for. The children were still in the loft, their voices faint as they stirred. Elias stepped back inside, shutting the cold out with the heavy thud of the door. "Keep them close today," he said. "I'll be working near the barn, but I don't want them out of sight." She nodded, her lips pressed in. "If they come." "They will," he said, not to scare her, but because lies had no place between them now. By mid-morning, the quiet had a weight to it. Elias was stacking wood against the north wall when he felt it, a shift in the air, the kind of stillness that comes before a storm. Only this one carried the faint creak of saddle leather. He straightened, listening. Then came the sound of hoofbeats, deliberate and slow, as if the riders wanted to be heard. He stepped into the barn and came out with the Winchester. Clara was at the door, her face pale, but steady. "Upstairs," he told her. "Cellar if you have to. Take the revolver." "What about you?" "I'll be here." The hoofbeats grew louder, and then they were there. 5 men on horseback, their coats dark against the snow, steam curling from the nostrils of their mounts. The one in front dismounted first, his movements unhurried. Clay Harlan. Elias didn't need an introduction. The man had the lean, fox-eyed look of someone who'd made his living off other people's pain. "Morning," Harlan called, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "We're looking for a woman and her young ones. Passed through here, maybe. Thought you might have seen them." Elias rested the rifle on his arm. "I've seen plenty of folks pass through. Can't say I keep track of them all." Harlan's smile was small and humorless. "See, I think you're the kind of man who notices things, and I think maybe you've noticed the ones I'm after." Elias didn't answer. Silence was its own kind of reply. Harlan's gaze flicked toward the cabin. "Won't take but a minute to check. You got nothing to hide, you won't mind." "That's close enough," Elias said, his voice like the frost on the windows. The man beside Harlan shifted in the saddle, resting a hand on the butt of his pistol. The air seemed to contract, pulling them all into the moment. Then Harlan's smile dropped. "Get him." The first shot came from Elias's rifle, loud and flat in the frozen air. One of the riders pitched sideways, out of his saddle, hitting the snow hard. The others scattered, firing as they moved. Bullets chewed into the porch post, splintering wood. Elias backed toward the door, firing again. Clara's voice came from inside, sharp and urgent. She got the children down into the cellar. A shadow moved at the corner of his vision, and he turned in time to see one of Harlan's men coming around the side of the barn, shotgun raised. Elias dropped to one knee, squeezed the trigger, and the man folded into the snow. The return fire was relentless. Glass shattered, a lamp inside went over with a crash, and the smell of kerosene filled the air. Elias ducked through the doorway, shoving the table over for cover. Clara was crouched by the trapdoor to the cellar, the revolver in her hand and her eyes steady despite the fear in them. "They're circling," Elias said. "If they get to the back, they'll be on top of us before." The rest was lost to the thunder of boots on the porch. One of Harlan's men kicked the door wide and stepped through, rifle leveled. Clara moved faster than thought, firing once. The man dropped, his weapon clattering on the floorboards. She stared at him for a heartbeat, chest rising and falling hard, then looked to Elias. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded, though her hands trembled. "They're not getting to the children." The fight spilled outside again, as Elias heard the crunch of boots retreating toward cover. He darted to the window, caught sight of Harlan himself moving toward the barn, and fired. The shot went wide, sending a puff of snow into the air near Harlan's leg. The outlaw ducked behind a feed cart, returning fire that shattered the window frame inches from Elias's head. For a long moment, it was a deadly game of movement and stillness. Harlan's men trying to press in close, Elias shifting positions to keep them guessing, Clara reloading the revolver with quick, sure hands. Then came the sound Elias had been waiting for, the sharp click of an empty chamber. He stepped into the open long enough to put down another of the riders, and that left just Harlan and one more man. The last of the crew made a rush for the cabin, and Elias dropped him in the yard. But the victory came at a cost. Pain seared through his shoulder, hot and immediate. He staggered back, rifle slipping in his grip, and Clara was there, steadying him. "You're hit," she said. "I'm standing in. He gave her the rifle. Harlan's still out there. She hesitated, then took it, checking the chamber the way he'd shown her days before. Elias leaned against the wall, trying to force the world to stay sharp. The cellar trapdoor was only a few steps away, but the sound of boots crunching in the snow told him Harlan was closing in. The outlaw appeared in the doorway a breath later, gun leveled, eyes fixed on Clara. "You should have kept running," he said. Clara's voice was steady. "I'm done running." Harlan's gaze flicked to Elias, and in that instant she fired. The shot took him high in the chest, the impact driving him back into the snow. He was still moving when Elias pushed himself to the door, pain screaming through his shoulder, and fired the last round into Harlan's heart. The quiet that followed was heavier than the fight had been. Snow drifted down, settling over the bodies in the yard, covering the blood like the land itself wanted to forget. Clara lowered the rifle slowly, her breath coming in short bursts. Elias leaned against the doorframe, the cold air biting into the heat of his wound. "You all right?" he asked again. She looked at him, then really looked, and for the first time since he'd met her, he saw something other than fear in her eyes. "We are now." They buried the bodies at the edge of the property, far enough from the house that the children wouldn't see. The work was slow. Elias could only use one arm, and Clara's strength was frayed thin, but they finished before the light began to fade. The snow had already begun to cover the mounds by the time they walked back to the cabin. Inside, the children came up from the cellar, their faces pale, but eager. Anna ran to her mother, Luke to Elias. The youngest clung to Clara's skirts, looking up at her as if the danger had been nothing more than a passing storm. They ate in near silence that night, the fire snapping in the hearth. Elias's shoulder throbbed, but the warmth in the room dulled it some. Clara moved about the cabin with quiet efficiency, tending to him without fuss. When the children were asleep, Elias sat at the table with a cup of coffee, watching the snow fall beyond the window. Clara joined him, her hands folded around her own cup. For a long while, neither spoke. Finally, she said, "You didn't have to do this for us." He looked at her, the firelight catching the lines time and loss had carved into his face. "Maybe I did. Maybe I needed a reason to fight again." Her eyes softened, and she nodded once. "Then maybe we both found what we needed." Outside, the snow kept falling, blanketing the yard in white, erasing the signs of what had happened that day. But inside, the cabin felt different, warmer, more alive. Elias knew trouble might find them again. The frontier had a way of testing those who thought themselves safe. But for now, they had the night. And for now, that was enough. In the years to come, Elias would think back on that day and know it had been the turning point, not just for him, but for all of them. Out here, survival wasn't just about holding ground. It was about finding something worth holding it for. Maybe the frontier wasn't just a place, but a test of what a person was willing to stand for. That winter morning, with the snow falling soft and steady, they'd stood for each other. And sometimes that was all a man needed.